But it's very good to be with you and have the opportunity of speaking about the development of Campion College. I hope at least some of what I might say tonight will be of interest to you in relation to the Cardijn Institute. I think if I might just begin with a couple of preliminary comments. Things about me, apart from what you may have already read, will probably come out in the course of our talk, because so much of this, it's terribly hard, given how personal it's been, to absent oneself personally from this story. So I'll keep cropping up in it with some of the other people who have been so important. But if I just begin with a couple of preliminary comments and then look at the various factors that went into the development of the college, building blocks, as I've called them, hopefully in a way that might be of interest in relating to the needs and challenges facing the Cardijn Institute. Campion had two main sources of inspiration. The first was the Catholic intellectual tradition, and this was mediated through certain authors, in particular the British cultural historian Christopher Dawson, and his seminally important book, The Crisis of Western Education, which came out in 1961. And the second person was G.K. Chesterton, who qualifies, I think, as a one-man Catholic liberal arts program. He only wrote 100 or so books, but an enormous amount of other occasional writing, as well as much public speaking. He wrote on everything and published in every genre. In a personal sense, I received this intellectual inheritance from my father, Alfred Schmude, who lived in Albury, and while that's across the border, as it were, he actually is a Victorian. He was born in Rutherglen and went to school in Yarrawonga, and then later at Assumption College, Kilmore. And he was an early member of the Campion Society, the Catholic adult education group that was founded in Melbourne in the early 1930s in honour of the 16th century English scholar and martyr, St. Edmund Campion. I first read Dawson's book on Catholic higher education in 1968, just after I'd left Sydney University, where I completed a BA. And I was immediately seized with the desire to open a Catholic liberal arts college in Australia. Perhaps as just an aside on the Campion Society of relevance to the Cardijn Institute, you probably are quite aware of Kevin Kelly, a founding member of the Campion Society in Melbourne and later as an Australian ambassador. And he actively promoted the ideas of Cardinal Cardijn and the Belgian-French model of lay Catholic action at that time, by contrast with the more clerically centred Italian model. So that was the first source of inspiration, Christopher Dawson's books, and underlying it, I suppose, Chesterton's writings. The second one was the Catholic liberal arts institutions in America, especially the newer ones that emerged in the 1970s, such as Thomas Aquinas College in California and Christendom College in Virginia. And they were in response to the religious and cultural and educational upheavals of that time. I had the chance to visit a number of these institutions in person in 1977, when I spent a few months in America on a Fulbright scholarship relating to university libraries. And I kept in touch with these Catholic liberal arts colleges and their leaders in the following years. Now, what this experience added to the Catholic intellectual tradition that I found so enriching was that a Catholic liberal arts college was not only desirable, but it was also feasible. It could work in our society. And this was in the face of the cultural headwinds that we faced even then, of diminishing religious faith on the one hand, and the prevailing patterns in higher education on the other, narrowly focused as they were on vocational preparation for the workplace and ceasing to offer a, broad general education at the undergraduate level. But these sources of inspiration by themselves would not have led to Campion. What made the project feasible was that I met and became close friends with a Brisbane businessman, James Power Sr. Now, the Power family were prominent in the hotel trade in Queensland. They owned and ran pubs. One member of the family, Bernie Power, sponsored the Brisbane Broncos rugby league team for some years. So Power was written across the Guernseys of the Broncos rugby league side. James brought to the project a blend of business nous and a readiness to take risks. And in particular, he generously supplied the seed capital required. So it highlights, I think, how distinctively Australian the origins of Campion were. By contrast with America, where the newer Catholic liberal arts colleges I've mentioned were founded by university academics at the centre of higher education, as it were, Campion was established by two unlikely friends, a librarian and a publican. If Crocodile Dundee had been around, we might have recruited him as well. You never know. First professor of river and reptile studies, maybe. But more seriously, James and I shared a Catholic faith and a desire to spread that faith. And we had a passion for learning, which was epitomised in the liberal arts. And this was despite the fact that James had not gone to university. He didn't have tertiary education experience, but he had a great love of learning. And these had a big effect on the early decisions that we took. And I'll just highlight two of these early decisions because I think they run strongly through the history of Campion's planning and development. Firstly, we wanted to be a genuinely Catholic institution, true to the Church's teaching in faith and morals, and also its educational heritage. And yet at the same time, we were not keen to be structurally part of any church organisations or agencies. We wanted to be lay run and we wanted to operate as an independent institution. The second decision was that we thought we should be a private institution, supported by the generosity of those who believed in what we were trying to do. This was crucial, we thought, if we were to achieve anything distinctive and worthwhile and not be subject to political pressures and distractions and bureaucratic restrictions. So we would avoid seeking government funding. Well, how did the ideas and hopes of Campion achieve reality? How did they get realised? I left my post as university librarian at the University of New England, is in that position, to work full-time on the Campion project. This was only possible because of James Power Sr.'s generous support. I was in my early 50s, so not quite on the threshold of retirement. My responsibility over the next few years was to work on what I'll call the Campion building blocks. And these were key things required to take the ideas and translate them into plans that would produce a functioning college. Let me just focus on these building blocks. I think you may have already seen the ones I'm going to address. There are 6 of them I've identified. The first was finding a campus. Initially, we looked outside of Sydney on the New South Wales Central Coast and the Southern Highlands. We focused on Sydney compared to other places, mainly because I guess of its size, the fact that I knew Sydney. I was a Sydney boy. I only moved to country New South Wales when I married. And it was, at that time anyhow, still, I suppose, the main centre for overseas travellers coming in. So for all sorts of reasons, Sydney was selected. We looked outside of Sydney. We looked at the central coast of New South Wales. We looked at the Southern Highlands. And this was not only for their lower property prices, but in the hope of finding a campus that offered rural quietness, that harmonised, I think, with what I might call the leisurely rigour of liberal arts education. And finally, we opted for a more conveniently located campus in Sydney. James and I knew the Bishop of Parramatta at that time, Kevin Manning. He'd previously been Bishop of Armidale, and James used to visit me often in Armidale. We both got to know Kevin Manning well. As Bishop of Parramatta, he offered us a 4-hectare site in the western suburb of Toongabbie near Parramatta. It was previously a seminary of the Maris Fathers, and in the 1970s it was acquired by the Parramatta Diocese. This site proved ideal. It had the essential infrastructure for a Catholic university college. It had lecture and tutorial rooms. It had student accommodation and catering facilities. It had a chapel and a library. And they were in a large central building on the campus, which had opened in the late 1930s and was extended in the 1950s as vocations increased during that time. Nearby were a number of temporary structures. The surrounding campus was tranquil. It was semi-rural, and it was detached from the busyness and noise of the city. It was close to Parramatta, and beyond that, not all that far from the Sydney CBD, particularly when we took into account that it was near the major east-west train line and an established freeway network. The vast spread of suburbs in Sydney had shifted the axis of development to the city's west, and as has happened in other cities in Australia. A rapidly expanding Parramatta and surrounding areas at the foot of the Blue Mountains were now a significant population and business region in Sydney. So that was the first building block, to find an attractive and a convenient site where we could operate, practical and visible and identifiable. And in that way, I think was symbolic of our purpose as a new Catholic educational institution of value. We certainly found, looking back, I think acquiring a campus early in the process was a great advantage in establishing Campion's credibility. Well, the second building block I'd look at is building a support base. And this covered really two key groups, donors on the one hand and future students on the other. We needed to have a database that could serve as a mailing list and also a management system for communicating with potential donors and the families of students. And the most promising source for these was the mailing list of Australian Catholic organisations and journals. And through our connections, we gained access to various subscription files, amounting, by the time we started using it in the early 2002, amounting to 13,000 names and addresses. They were acquired quite legally. They didn't fall off the back of a computer, as it were. But they certainly were acquired, I think, before privacy legislation and the cost of data sharing became much more significant issues. Now, there was some overlap of donors and student families, the two key groups I've mentioned, but they were largely distinct, at least in terms of age profile. The most likely donors were those above 50 years of age, in some cases retired, and in time possible bequesters, whereas the potential students were most likely, as one would expect, to come from families with children in senior high school who were contemplating university options. And in the college's first year, 2006, when we opened, the bulk of our 16 students came from families, especially in New South Wales and Victoria, who learnt about Campion from being part of those original mailing lists. How did we communicate with this support base? Well, 4 years before we opened, in 2006, this was in 2002, I started a newsletter, a 4-page newsletter. It was called Campion's Brag, and that was the name of the manifesto that some of you may know St Edmund Campion wrote at the height of the Reformation, explaining his return to his homeland and almost certain martyrdom as part of what was called the English mission. The brag was a disparaging tag bestowed by Campion's enemies. But I thought, apart from the historical link with our patron, it had a somewhat cheekily Aussie ring to it. And in 16th century England, the brag was a call to action by St Edmund Campion, and we hoped it would help to inspire people to support our new educational venture 4 centuries later in faraway Australia. The newsletter carried the subtitle, under Campion's brag, Catholic Learning in the Liberal Arts. And the challenge really was to develop a compelling story for our readers, which would convey the unique attraction of a Campion education as a bold initiative by lay Catholics to fill what we saw as a significant gap in Catholic and Australian higher education. But at the same time, we had to ensure that it didn't sound irrelevant to the career-related expectations of students and their parents who were looking at post-school options. The first issue of Campion's brag may not come up too well there on the screen, but that was the first issue, came out in 2002, and it addressed these various dimensions. On the one hand, it described the value of a liberal arts education in fostering the maturity of the whole person, and it offered this by embracing the transcendentals, truth and beauty and goodness. So seeking to develop a mind in love with truth, a heart in love with beauty, and a will in love with goodness. And on the other hand, the newsletter attempted to explain the advantages of such a program in preparing students for the workplace. We cited, for example, the prevalence of liberal arts degrees among America's foremost business leaders, the Fortune 500 chief executives, over half of whom had liberal arts degrees, and the benefits of doing a general degree prior to the specialisation of a higher degree and a choice of career. We did stress the financial needs of the new college. As a private institution, it would rely on student fees and personal donations and bequests. These were in particular upgrading the campus buildings and creating a scholarships scheme for students. Campion had no students of its own at that stage, so the early issues of the brag published a column that I devised, which I called A Foretaste of Campion. And we were fortunate in finding a number of young Australian students who'd experienced the Catholic liberal arts program in America. And they wrote about that in the early issues of the benefits that they'd received as a foretaste of what a Campion education would hopefully provide. One person who contributed her reflections, for example, was the eldest daughter of James Power Senior, Erica. She wrote of her 4-year undergraduate study at Campion College in Virginia. Now, the targeted mail out of our regular newsletter, it came out quarterly, reflected the market niche which Campion needed to develop. And this in particular was Catholic families whose serious devotion to their faith and their hopes for their children was most likely to predispose them to a new form of higher education. And yet they would have been aware, of course, that Campion was an untried institution, promising to prepare their teenage children for a life of Christian faithfulness and service, as well as for employment. I must say I greatly admired the young students and their families who placed their trust in Campion in those first years. They were all risk takers. Well, just to move to the third building block, which is organising fundraising and governance structures. Speaking of donor support, it might be of interest to the Cardijn Institute if I spoke briefly about the dual board structure that we developed at Campion, again, before we opened. This was an early priority for us to to distinguish the issues of governance and finance. And from the outset, we wanted to make clear our prime aim, and that was to establish Campion for educational purposes, not as a profit-making venture. We wanted to show that Campion would be supplying a public good. It would offer a new kind of higher education in Australia that would add to the diversity of the overall system. As a not-for-profit undertaking, we hope to gain tax deductibility for donations. And we really saw this as having two good effects. The obvious one was the financial attraction to donors of such a concession, but a more subtle one, I think, more subtle advantage, was that it would strengthen the social credibility of the new institution. That the Australian Tax Office, not readily known as a soft government agency, would recognise the public benefit that Campion would confer and therefore extend tax deductions, tax deductibility. Fortunately, we were able to achieve this gift recipient status several years before we opened. Now, while our prime purpose was educational and non-profit, we had to ensure financial viability. And that meant giving immediate and determined attention to fundraising. So a very large part of my responsibility right through the years, including after we opened, I retired in a work sense from Campion in 2015, but right through those years before we opened and the first 10 years, I focused in particular on that whole need. Now, to make this distinction structurally clear between governance and finance, we decided to establish two legal entities, two separate companies. One was the Campion Foundation, to focus on financial issues, that is fundraising and the acquisition and the control of assets, such as the future campus and its buildings. And the other was the Campion Institute. Its role would be governance. So it would be responsible for the appointment of the college president and other staff. It would set institutional priorities and formulate policies. And it would apply for accreditation so that we could award degrees and then confer those degrees formally in a meeting of the Campion Institute at graduation. I think this dual structure has served Campion well. The two boards meet together. Many of the directors are members of both boards, but keeping a structural distinction between running the institution and raising funds for its operation has been important, I think, both functionally and symbolically. And I say symbolically because it has kept in the forefront of our minds all the time the imperative need for ongoing fundraising. Well, to turn to the fourth building block, and that is developing an academic program and achieving accreditation. Now, in designing a liberal arts program that would be achievable in Australian conditions, we were conscious of a number of guiding principles. The first was to establish a balance between intellectual inspiration and teaching practicality. The program needed to convey a vision of transcendental meaning and purpose, drawn from the historical experience of a people whose lives were decisively changed by the coming of Christ, the direct insertion of God into human history in the most unmistakable way. It needed to open students' minds and hearts to a rich heritage of learning and cultural experience, embodied in the books, in Matthew Arnold's famous words that present the best which has been thought and said, which their previous education had not necessarily given them, certainly in a coherent and systematic way. And yet we wanted to go beyond the great books as they've been known, so that students could see the significance of their culture, the way of life of a people, in an eternal context, not just relating to this life. The second principle of the Campion degree was what we saw as the desirability of a core curriculum. The liberal arts program at Campion comprised certain key subjects that all students needed to complete. And in Campion's case, there were 4: history, philosophy, literature, and theology. When I originally put the submission to the accreditation authorities, there were actually 7. There was language, specifically Latin at that time, with the intention of Greek down the track. There was science, and there was mathematics. And the accreditation, when we came to that process, they felt that it was far too demanding for present-day students to handle that number of subjects, and they really compelled us to limit it to 4. So these were the 4 that we selected. History as the lived experience of a people. Philosophy as the ideas that animated and guided their way of life. Literature as the imagination engaging with reality to enliven and deepen our understanding of it. And theology as our relationship with God and the transcendent that lifts our appreciation of reality and injects it with ultimate meaning and purpose and fulfillment. I think the concept of a core curriculum reflected 2 things. It made clear its character as a foundational degree, an undergraduate degree that was foundational, and therefore on which all sorts of later degrees could be built. And secondly, it proclaimed its intellectual authority as comprising the necessary knowledge for students to embrace an understanding of their own culture, before they might move on later, of course, to appreciate and understand other cultures. By contrast, the standard undergraduate degree in Australia was an educational smorgasbord, a mass of miscellaneous courses that lacked any principle of unity or cultural integrity. A core curriculum, by contrast, was designed to give students a set of fundamental subjects studied from ancient to modern times so as to reveal the life of an historical people as a coherent cultural and religious story. At the same time, the Campion program had to be realistic. It had to be alert to present-day needs and expectations, while yet hoping to lift expectations and go beyond them. It had to accommodate students and, of course, parents' expectation that the 3-year degree at Campion would be a worthwhile preparation for the workplace and living in society. And we hoped, so far as we could demonstrate this, that it would encourage, of course, students to enrol in it, parents to support it, and it would inspire donors to sponsor it. Yeah, a question that was often asked later, I must say, was whether Campion could have been established earlier or later. In retrospect, I think the timing of the college's development seems to me to have been just right. While the original conceiving of it, I guess, in my case, was right back in the late 1960s, as I mentioned, when I gave a talk to the first staff in 2006 that we'd appointed at Campion, the inaugural faculty and support staff. And I began by saying it had taken more than 36 years for Campion to become an overnight success. Well, could we have established it earlier? I don't think things were bad enough at that time in higher education and the culture more broadly to give us a sense of urgency. Could we have established it later, like now or in recent times? I think then we would not have been able to access a still popular Catholic culture and a set of potential supporters to the extent we were fortunate in attracting. As the past 2 decades have revealed, this culture was rapidly vanishing in Australia. Well, to turn briefly to accreditation, while we shunned the seeking of government funding, we knew we needed the authority of government approval in terms of Campion, firstly as a registered institution of higher education in the nation, and its liberal arts degree is accredited. And this was a time-consuming process, a tedious one, as you might expect, but it was achieved in 2005, the year before we opened, so that we could present an institution and an academic degree that carried weight in the marketplace. Well, the fourth building block, appointing the president and faculty. Now, designing a liberal arts degree that would meet Australian educational conditions and offer appeal to Australian students was only part of the Campion challenge. Our next step was to appoint a leader of the new college. And the position of president called for an unusual blend of qualities on account of the unusual nature of Campion as a university-level institution that was born of Catholic inspiration, independently run and privately funded, and having as its core offering a general undergraduate degree in the liberal arts. Now, any, if not all of these attributes could be expected to limit the potential field in Australia. Candidates we thought were likely to come from two main sources. One was a university sector in Australia that was government funded and regulated. And it was not accustomed to the fundraising imperatives of a private independent institution. It was vocationally organised, offering degrees that were career oriented and often subject to government quotas, in effect related to employment needs. The other likely source was a church setting, such as a seminary, with limited exposure to the conditions facing a college operating in the public square in competition with secular institutions, which had established reputations, student recruitment flows, and they also had more or less assured government funding, even if this was diminishing. So the president needed to capture and, in a sense, incarnate the potential of the new college to succeed, as well as its public credibility. Could Campion deliver what it promised? Well, we were fortunate, I think, in attracting Father John Fleming, an Adelaide priest, as our first president. He had the academic qualifications and expertise, and also the public experience in secular journalism and media to help establish Campion's reputation and credibility in those vital initial years. Now, our next challenge was to appoint the academic staff. Some of the qualities we wanted in the president applied as well to the faculty, such as a clear understanding of the liberal arts and the Catholic intellectual tradition. But an additional need was the desire and ability to teach a broad and integrated curriculum. Would we be able to find lecturers in Australia who could present courses in this educational form, and moreover in a new non-government institution with no guarantee of survival or promise of job security? The challenge was acute, given the specialised focus of modern academic work, as well as the common preference for research over teaching, especially the teaching of undergraduates. In the event, our fledgling college was able to appoint an inaugural faculty who gave a balanced injection of experience and youthful energy. Each of Campion's first academic staff was at home with the culture of the liberal arts. They were keen to teach such a program as it had been designed and accredited. The further benefit we sought in those early years was to attract the support of prominent leaders in education and society. In the educational sphere, for example, we decided to ask the University of Sydney to enter into a formal agreement to mentor Campion College. And Sydney University agreed to do this, so that apart from lending weight to the college's emergence by being publicly associated with it, Sydney University assisted with the benchmarking of assignments in the early years and the endorsement of the academic quality of our program. If we look at the broader social and political and religious arena, we were able to attract endorsements from such figures as Sir Peter Cosgrove, when he was an Australian military leader. This was just after he got back from East Timor, where he headed up the UN peacekeeping force, long before he became Governor General. I was at school with Peter Cosgrove, as it happened, and was able to ask whether he would support the venture, again, well before we opened, and he was immediately enthusiastic about it. We had other people who were very happy to support it publicly. Les Murray, the poet, Christopher Koch, the Tasmanian novelist, and of course various Catholic bishops and lay people, lay academics, bishops in different dioceses, in particular Cardinal George Pell, who was a strong advocate for Campion from the very beginning when he was in Melbourne. Finally, we established an international advisory board. Now, this was made up of well-respected Catholic scholars in various countries, attached to various institutions, particularly in America and England, but we had ones from other countries too, such as Japan, and they were willing to provide advice to Campion on academic and institutional issues. Again, there was a symbolic aspect to this, our desire to show this is not just an Australian initiative. This is not something that's just local. It's got global interest, global support. So that was one part of it, apart from the practical support that such people could extend to Campion. Well, just to move now to the fifth and last one I've got, really building a library and learning infrastructure. The fifth building block. While the new electronic scholarly resources, of course, that emerged well before this, were a boon in the area of scholarly journals, so we could avoid having to invest in large, expensive, bound, printed sets of journals that access the scholarly databases. We believe strongly in the value of a rich collection of printed books, and thought that this was an important resource to have on campus for Campion students and faculty, that we could own and have available, not just gain access to or lease. It was in particular in harmony with the nature of a liberal arts education and the ways in which that education encourages intellectual discovery and the process of synthesising learning, that is, making the connections between ideas and insights across the core disciplines, across the history and the philosophy and the literature and theology. Education was not just about the retrieval and absorption of information so readily provided by the new electronic tools. It had a deeper educational purpose, and that was intellectual awakening and reflection and debate, and the slow, patient cultivation of wisdom. We were fortunate in acquiring 2 source collections to form the basis of the Campion Library. These were from closed Catholic religious houses, so many of which were closing in this period as we moved into the new millennium. And the 2 that we were able to buy in their entirety was the collection that the Dominicans had at their seminary in Canberra, in the suburb of Watson, and the MSCs had at a seminary in Melbourne, in Croydon, which later moved to Sydney. An early supporter of Campion and a faithful one right through right to his death in 2019 was Father Paul Stenhouse, the MSc priest and editor of Annals. And he was the one that alerted me to the availability of that collection. As you would expect, as seminary collections, they were strong in philosophy and theology, to some extent in history, but not in literature. But then providentially, a priest in Canberra, Father Hilton Roberts, who was about to retire, contacted me and offered Campion his substantial collection, some thousands of volumes, which were especially strong in literature as well as in history. So the good Lord, I decided at that time, gentlemen, is a great designer of new academic library collections. Well, let me conclude with this thought, if I may. From the outset, Campion was not seen as bound by the criteria of secular success. It was, of course, a project that had to be professionally developed and implemented. But finally, we saw it as an educational initiative with a purpose transcending the practical. In the words of the American Catholic poet, Dana Gioia, that purpose was to, quote, renew the ancient vision. It was to find a fresh way of responding to the light of Christ and incarnating his redemptive truths, in this case, in an educational enterprise. We did carry out a lot of planning, of course, and we approached the project systematically, as I've tried to indicate. But later, when asked if we'd undertaken a feasibility plan, we had to say no. It would have told us that it was unlikely to succeed, and that was not an acceptable answer. As James Power Sr., the businessman, used to say to me about Campion, if this was simply a business venture, Karl, I would never bar of it. The project was always a long shot. Australia lacked models and precedents for a venture like Campion. There was no tradition of liberal arts colleges, such as in America. There was no experience of private universities for Campion to invoke as a model, but Bond and Notre Dame came along a bit later. Finally, we couldn't rely on religious models either, as the churches, Catholic and Protestant, had not been active or adventurous at this level in Australia. There was the extensive system of religious schools, of course, at the primary and secondary levels, but not at the tertiary level. The churches had focused on the founding of student residential colleges at public universities. So in the final analysis, Campion, if it were to exist, would embody its own beauty. As James Power Sr. again put it so well, I think, reminiscent of a favourite saint in Australia, St. Therese of Lisieux, he said, Campion would be a little flower in the desert. And yet the very lack of established reference points and historical precedents, I think, had a paradoxical advantage for us. It highlighted an overlooked need in Australia and a silent opportunity for a Catholic liberal arts college. And this gave us a certain freedom to forge ahead. Campion would aim to fulfil a neglected educational purpose, and that is to offer a broad program of core subjects as a time-proven foundation for further study or various career choices. In addition, Campion would hopefully be a social and political assertion of cultural difference, a new kind of model for the strengthening of religious culture and identity in Australia. It would help to prepare Catholics and others to deal with the challenges we now faced as a people, of a culture that was becoming spiritually exhausted and religiously disenchanted, and yet floundering in a sea of mounting anxieties and bouts of despair, lurching from one fashionable confusion to another. We cherished the hope that Campion could be a creative response to these conditions and a beacon of hope.